to know is what got us banished from the Garden of Eden. Are you prepared to be cast out again, Eve?
Yes.
We are laser focused on our mission of warfighting.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Now, I would like to ask you a very personal question. Who controls what you believe? Who shapes your concept of reality? And I'm going to take you on a very long journey for about 3 hours. And in this study, I'm going to teach you how to protect yourself against deception. Now, it's a very in-depth study, so you better fasten your seatbelts. And as I encourage you at all times, especially in this study, please, every single thing you see in this study, research what you believe, because it can affect your decisions for the future.
With the power of advertising, when we plug our thought into that digital space, when we rise in the morning until we rest at night, there is a 24/7, 365 AI-driven algorithmic marketing system that is cleverly designed by high echelon Ivy League trained tech wizards who have ever so closely studied human behavior and have created sophisticated technology that tracks us, keeps our attention, isolates us from real one-on-one, real meaningful human relationships, and each day we are slowly being dumbed down, indoctrinated and being reprogrammed so that people who are oceans apart, though they have cultural, political, religious and even linguistic differences, will eventually think the same and have a one world view. And if people are constantly busy with their guards down, human history can be intelligently and cleverly altered, where the world can be shaped and fit into a well planned out and crafted paradigm that has been in the pipeline for years by the invisible government.
A lot of these kids don't know how to read because they have had things read to them, or they can click a button and have something read out loud.
I need to study for an exam tomorrow on my social psychology class.
What specific topic or concept are you focusing on for this exam?
Hey, you seem down.
LG Affectionate Intelligence recognizes your mood. And helps get it back on track.
To the end. When you need.
Hi, LG.
Cause everybody needs a friend.
Rivermind is a revolution in neurological science.
Redream is a system that we're using. We're making the movie in real time. They're AIs, they're constructs.
We'd like to welcome you back.
Ready?
Yeah. 3, 2.
And action.
They call it mind expanding. It alters your neuronal structure. The mind is a computer.
Somebody got into our heads. Neurons got exposed and circuits got rewired.
Flick of a switch, we can adjust character, change personality.
These are not supposed to exist.
Somehow history has been rewritten. There has to be a reason this is happening.
Okay, Google. Text T. Targets tracked to exchange point. 36 hours in pursuit. And we're still going strong. Show me my images of London. Sending images now. Distance to MI6.
Agent?
Negative, that'll take too long. I'll send them now.
Is the connection secure?
It's a Nokia phone.
Got them.
I need you to check the inscriptions on these.
Copy that, Agent.
So as the narrator has repeated many times, we are all on a global digital database with these handheld devices that always keeps us occupied and sometimes idle, know a lot more about us than we are consciously aware of and are willing to admit. And regardless of our ethnicity, our social status, or our sexual orientation, the whole world has turned into a global village, leaving very little room for privacy. And no one will be exempt, the narrator will explain. The Amazon rainforest in South America covers North Brazil, parts of Colombia, Peru, and other South American countries. It is the largest tropical rainforest on the earth, with the longest river, with creatures endemic to that region that you will not find nowhere else on the earth. For years, anthropologists, archaeologists, and zoologists have penetrated into its inner sanctum, and there are tribes that are still uncontacted, that are isolated from the rest of the world. Huge corporations have infringed on the freedoms of indigenous communities to expand their profits at the expense of innocent people. And this has been an ongoing trend since the 19th century, when British companies exploited these simple, living, semi-naked tribes to extract the natural resources in that once untouched territory. And these companies sadly use blacks from the Caribbean island in the West Indies of Barbados to manage their region as a sort of security venture. Why were these people of the Amazon viewed as subhumans? Most of the time you have to trace it to Western literature. The University of Oxford in England still, to this very day, is the most respected academic institution on the earth. It has produced many brilliant minds, but some of them were deeply colonial and racially biased. One of them was Arnold Joseph Toynbee, an English historian and philosopher. Continuing the very narrow worldview of Friedrich Hegel and Edward Gibbon, it was expanded upon in his multi-volume work titled A Study of History. And it is intellectual works like this that shapes the thinking of a generation and their successors. And when describing the people of the Amazon rainforest, he said, quote, "The Andean civilization came into existence on a high plateau, and its achievement was in deep contrast with the, and look at the word underlined, savagery ensconced in the Amazon rainforest below. Because we admit the idea, we ought to glance at the same equatorial latitude in Africa, where the East African highlands fringe the forests of the Congo Basin, which is the second largest rainforest in the world. We shall find that in Africa, the plateau was no more productive a civilized society than the tropical forests of the Great Valley. Now, the Mayan civilization that is in Central America emerged amid the tropical rainfall and segregation of Guatemala and British Honduras. But no such civilization ever arose out of, and look at the word underlined again, savagery, in the similar conditions on both the Amazon and the Congo. For he says that the black races alone have not contributed positively to any civilization as yet. That's funny. So according to the so-called historical analysis of Arnold Toynbee, the Andean mountains that was once populated with peoples like the Incas, and the Mayan civilization had highly sophisticated civilizations. What about the people of the Amazon? Well, this argument will now be put to rest. With the use of LiDAR technology, which is a remote sensing laser scanner that shows 3D mapping of a region, it has confirmed that the people of the Amazon did once have a highly sophisticated civilization and were not savages. But even with this newly discovered evidence, they have still been added to the global database, so they can become so-called, and I'll put it in quotes, civilized like the rest of us. And the man who has made this possible is the richest man on earth, Elon Musk. But what technology did he use?
There are over 500,000 square miles of the U.S. unreachable by any cell phone tower. Places where emergency texts never send, where emotional messages are not received, and countless memories are left unshared.
Doing good. You're doing good.
But T-Mobile is about to change that. T-Mobile partnered with Starlink to launch hundreds of satellites, creating the only space-based network that automatically connects to the phone you already have. And because connection means everything, we're inviting anyone on any wireless carrier to experience it for free.
You won't believe where I am right now.
T-Mobile Starlink.
Mr. Elon Musk's satellite technology has penetrated deep into the Amazon basin, where remote tribes, once separated from the rest of the world, are now connected. And guess what? When a reporter from CNN asked these young people what do they enjoy scrolling through, one of them responded, Facebook. Now this is exactly what Meta's founder Mark Zuckerberg said to Time magazine in the year 2014, that he wants to connect the whole human family through his social media site. Now there are people who are using Meta to connect to this virtual world. And yes, it is true that friends who have lost contact for years have reconnected through Facebook. But the narrator always wanted to know, how will the whole world be brought under one global umbrella? And today you can see how, and it is already having a backlash. For in the Amazon, the internet via Starlink is now making the children lazy and totally hooked to social media. But they are not the only ones. The US government and its media team, to glorify one of its biggest business transactions, went to the Middle East in May 2025 to expand its corporate interests. Now Qatar has the largest US military base in the Middle East, and Boeing cut some checks when it signed a multi-billion-dollar deal with the UAE. Others included Elon Musk, Jensen Huang, the co-founder and CEO of Nvidia, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the head of IBM, the head of Palantir, and the president and chief investment officer of Alphabet and Google. And there were other tech companies also who were continuing to expand the American empire, continuing the same US policy since the First Gulf War. Not to promote peace in the region, but to continue to ally themselves with absolute monarch dictators in that region. And where is this all leading to? There are only a very small people the narrator knows of who are aware that the United States is going to restore the oldest institution on earth, the papacy, to its former medieval glory. Your average person will think that such an agenda is ridiculous, but they are totally unaware and ignorant of the fact that the entire structure of our earth today is modeled to the absolute T on how papal controlled Europe once was, a system of complete surveillance that was stepped up during the Inquisition. With the decay and decline of the West, which today they are now admitting, and with many crying out for its restoration, it may surprise you, but people are looking to both Trump and the Pope for hope. But how will Trump pull things off? Well, if you ever want to control people, you control their history by altering the past and rewriting the narrative. Now this may be shocking to many, but one man foresaw this coming, and he published it in a book that was published just after the close of the Second World War in 1949. And he must have had some insight into what the future would be like. And though he has a lot of controversy around his name, his most famous work is the book 1984. And this is what George Orwell said, quote, "By 2050, earlier probably, all real knowledge of old speak will have disappeared. The whole literature of the past will have been destroyed. The whole climate of thought will be different. In fact, there will be no thought as we understand it now. Books also were recalled and rewritten again and again, and were invariably reissued without any admission that any alteration had been made. All history was a palimpsest, scraped clean and reinscribed exactly as often as necessary. In no case would it have been possible once the deed was done to prove that any falsification had taken place, nor was any item of news or any expression of opinion which conflicted with the needs of the moment ever allowed to remain on record. The alteration of the past is necessary. Thus, history is continuously rewritten. This day-to-day falsification of the past, it is argued, have no objective existence. The rulers can do what? Twist reality into whatever shape they choose, to conquer the whole surface of the earth, and to extinguish once and for all the possibility of independent thought. Every record has been destroyed or falsified. Every book has been rewritten. Every picture has been repainted. Every statue and building has been renamed. Every date has been cleverly altered. And that process is continuing. How often? Day by day, minute by minute. History has stopped. Interesting. Something to think about.
That he's creating a culture of fear in universities. They already have done this in states like Florida, creating a culture of fear in K through 12 education. But authoritarianism requires a culture of fear. It requires feeling like the state is always looking over your shoulder, feeling like there are vague rules that you can be punished for, and your fellow citizens have been empowered to report you. That's the first thing it means. The second thing it means is that there's an official state ideology. And if you violate the official state ideology, you get in trouble.
One of the main reasons why most people in the world will overlook the aggressive imperialist Heritage Foundation agenda of the demagogue Trump 2.0 is because the entertainment industry that consists of military advertisements, films and video games is subtly breaking down our resistance and cleverly psychologically training us on the upcoming global military takeover, where they are advertising their latest weapons and well-trained military and mercenary special force units, and are conditioning people to accept human rights abuses where the clock or the pendulum will eventually turn on us all.
What began as riots in major US cities has ignited a global firestorm. Global tensions have reached a critical point tonight. Years of rising authoritarianism, collapsing democracies, and unchecked nationalism have pushed the world past its breaking point. The fate of our democracies hangs in the balance.
Now the narrator would like to ask a very personal question to everyone that is watching and listening. Who controls how you think, and what has shaped your worldview? Does the media shape your reality, or your inbuilt cultural one-sided biases? Honestly, who influences how you perceive reality? And do you hate or despise groups or peoples you have never interacted with in your entire life? And if so, why? The narrator had the opportunity of spending 5 years of his life studying media, and it is quite amazing how it works. We buy things that we really don't need. We idolize people who we don't know anything about. And the power of advertising can shape a cultural mindset and mold us into a very interesting way of thinking that we are not aware of. Now, there's a reason for this. Companies have to make money. But while we are distracted from what is really going on, almost a century ago, a woman researched and documented that those creature comforts we have and freedoms that we cherish will be cleverly removed. Her name was Edith Starr Miller, and she mysteriously died in Paris, France, in the year her book was posthumously published, titled Occult Theocracy, in 1933. Some have labelled her a fascist, racist, or a conspiracy theorist. Whatever her worldview, she saw something that was in the pipeline, and she said, quote, "I have endeavoured to expose some of the means and methods used by a secret world, one might almost say an underworld, to do what? To penetrate, dominate, and destroy not only the so-called upper classes, but also the better portion of all classes." Now, this woman was researching this book for 10 years before she died. But was she right? Well, listen to the words of this Singapore professor, Wang Gongwa. And though he is talking about the United States, the ripple effect is felt throughout the entire world.
But they lost their jobs. All the jobs and manufacturing jobs were disappearing. And so the net consequence was the middle class in America did not benefit from that. The upper rich capitalists benefited tremendously, became much, much richer than ever. So the liberal economy actually, you might say, fulfilled the principle that the rich would get richer and the middle class would stagnate and the poor get poorer.
As the economic divide increases globally, though Hollywood always forewarns us and indirectly tells us what the future would look like, especially with the AI technology that is already threatening many people's livelihoods. One man had access to the archives of the Hoover Institution and Library on War, Revolution and Peace at Stanford University in California, in the United States. He was the British-born and educated economist, the late Anthony Cyril Sutton, an absolute brilliant investigative writer. In one of his books published in 1976 titled Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, near the end of the book he detailed how the media ever so cleverly shapes our worldview. And he said, quote, "Through control of a dozen or so newspapers run by editors who think alike, public information that we receive can be almost, and look at the word highlighted in green, orchestrated at will. Yesterday the space program, today an energy crisis or a campaign for ecology, but look at the words highlighted in blue, tomorrow a war in where? The Middle East or some other, and look at the word highlighted in green, manufactured crisis. Today, the media is the most powerful tool for mind control, where they can program you to accept a narrative without question. But this has been an ongoing plan for years, and in a book titled Mind Controllers that the narrator brought a number of years ago, it documented one of the earliest modern pioneers of mind control. His name was William Joseph, nicknamed Wild Bill Donovan, an Irish-American soldier, lawyer and intelligence officer, who headed and founded the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, which is also where he is considered as the founding father. He was commended for his work in intelligence, where this Roman Catholic was awarded by Pope Pius XII in the Vatican. He was given the Order of Saint Sylvester, that was his knighthood, and he introduced into modern warfare a strategy called PSYOPs. PSYOPs, or psychological warfare, according to Rand, involves the planned use of propaganda and other psychological operations to influence what? The opinions, emotions, attitudes, and behavior of opposition groups. Interesting. NATO calls it cognitive warfare, and according to Professor Robert McCreight, a retired US Army Special Operations veteran, in cognitive warfare, the human mind becomes the battlefield. The aim is to change not only what people think, but how they both think and act. Waged successfully, it shapes and influences on both individual and groups' beliefs and behaviors to favor an aggressor's tactical and strategic objectives, or as a West Indian once phrased it, servants unconsciously imbibe their master's psychology. How? By inheriting the Western narrative of Arnold Toynbee, Edward Gibbon, and Friedrich Hegel, that some people groups are what? Savages, that strips them of their human dignity. Then you will start to use William Sidney Porter's phrase, like the banana republics, and the term of Alfred Sauvy, who coined the phrase the third world. And once you see the world through a Western colonial lens, then you will follow the narrative without question. The narrator will explain. The 21st century was flooded after 9/11 and a little before that with the hysteria that there is an Islamic plot to take over Western freedoms, and the only way to stop it is by going to war for the oil and the gas. The propaganda did fully work at the beginning, and films like World War Z that the narrator has already shown in previous studies were PSYOPs programming tools to depict Palestinians as bloodthirsty zombies trying to evade the so-called peaceful state of Israel. The film was conditioning the world to have less empathy for them if they are depicted as third world savages, so that when children are murdered on camera in real time, we would close our hearts to their suffering. After many months of constant murder on innocent Palestinian civilians by Israel, that was with full logistic, military and financial support by both the United States and the UK, for the first time the pendulum has swung, and not only are people of Israeli descent protesting, but in an open solidarity of hypocrisy, leaders from Eurasia, that is the EU and the Middle East, are condemning the atrocities that no one can seem to ignore. But why has there been a cold silence? And why is it then, when the United States was signing the largest defense sales in US history, the narrator managed to film protesters outside of London's Royal Courts of Justice, who used a strategic place to protest the arming of Israel? But why has there been such a long silence? DJ Khaled is the most famous Palestinian in the public space who profits from urban music, where he likes to remind people who he is when he mentions his name in nearly every video appearance. But many have observed a silence from him concerning Palestine. While people of influence get a tap on the shoulder from the big boys in the invisible government, and are warned about what happens to those of influence who speak out against US foreign policy, they are dealt with. And in the United States, there is a long history of journalists who did not stay in their lane, and they all just, well, mysteriously died in very strange circumstances. Some of them were even found with their hands chopped off when they wanted to expose the US involvement in interfering with other people's governments. So DJ Khaled was probably told to stay in his lane, eat your halal meat, and tell people that you have the key. Now, the EU, World Bank, and the United Nations recorded that the damage in Gaza amounted to $18.5 billion, and it would cost $50 billion to rebuild it. And the reason there was a silence because the editor-in-chief of the London Guardian got the tap on the shoulder, and she told her staff to stay in their lane when it comes to Israel and Palestine. Why was the BBC quiet? Well, Robbie Gibbs, who sits on its editorial standards, is linked to the newspaper, the Jewish Chronicle. BBC News site's Colonel Richard Kemp is linked to the Israeli army. And members of Keir Starmer's UK Labour Party are also pro-Israel. In the United States, the evangelicals are pro-Israel, and they think murdering Palestinians is a fulfillment of Bible prophecy, and this is God's will. Meta's Mark Zuckerberg has banned pro-Palestinian messages on Facebook. Microsoft does business with the Israelis, and it provides AI technology to the Israeli military. And it should also be noted that both Google and Amazon are tied to the Israeli army through Project Nimbus. So when President Donald Trump at his inauguration was parading to the world the leading corporate tech mafia, he was telling us all we can do whatever we want and there are no consequences. And the entertainment industry, like the declining Hollywood and its partnership with the Pentagon, indoctrinates our thinking with films like Black Hawk Down that also promote US imperialism in the Muslim world. And who supplied Ridley Scott with the military hardware? Well, these are his own words.
I can say, I want to bring in 4 Black Hawks and 4 Nightbirds. But to do that, I've got to bring 125 Rangers. You know what a Ranger is? It's heavy duty, real thing. Because they'll be the insurance on the Black Hawk. And I can't have my actors fast roping down that. That's got to be a Ranger, because if somebody falls, I'm in trouble. And he says, I'll do that, but you have to get the Pentagon to write me a note inviting us to send to me because I welcome the American army and their devices. So he did that. He wrote in to the Pentagon. The Pentagon says, okay, we're on. So we sent in 4 Black Hawks, 4 Nightbirds, and 125 Rangers.
Now, Hollywood has glamorized the US military's foreign missions in Afghanistan by showing the military as the world's savior in the Iron Man franchise. And yes, they admitted that they trained the Afghans during the Cold War in the film Charlie Wilson's War. But what they don't tell you, they're not training by the US CIA and Britain's SAS. The Washington Post documented that the Afghan children's textbooks with violent images and militant Islamic teachings were imported to Afghanistan from, guess where? The United States of America. So these young jihadi children were being trained not from Islamic countries, but with literature from the United States. So who trains jihadis? Don't you find it strange that the BBC pays the Taliban propaganda wing so it can broadcast in Afghanistan, according to the London Telegraph? The BBC said that Bosnia was once the jihadi centre of the world, but London Guardian documented that these jihadis were armed by the United States. Interesting. The LA Times documented that both the Pentagon and the CIA armed these groups in Syria, and MI6 was embarrassed for she was exposed and also admitted that she was heavily involved in the war in Syria. Now, the recently deposed President Assad, who himself is not innocent, was blamed for the chemical attacks in Syria. Assad knew it was a scam, and the United Nations Carla Del Ponte investigation showed it was not Assad, but the US trained rebels. And the Daily Mail said that the US backed a plan to launch a chemical weapon attack on Syria, and then it will blame it on Assad's regime. And guess what? They took down this article. You can't find it. And just as George Orwell said, they will rewrite history and scrape evidence clean away that they don't want to be traced, so you will not know what is really going on. And despite this, many of the most famous influencers are using their platforms and are complaining that immigrants from the Islamic world are illegally flooding their Western cultures. And when influential people continue to spread this fake news, what effect do you think it will have on the misinformed and on the uneducated?
I think, yes, what drove those riots in Southport, there'd been you could feel it was going to come, that there would be. This pressure valve was going to just explode. In the lead up to the elections that just preceded the Southport riots, the Conservative Party made just everything about race and immigration. We had a Home Secretary who described our country as being invaded.
So through psyops and cognitive warfare, the tightly controlled corporate media can shape our worldview, target a group, make us hate them, and it can cause upheavals that includes riots and complicity to war. But the narrator would like to ask another question. How do we explain to man what is really going on in the world when all the drama is so fast-paced? And who or what can we reliably run to for answers? Well, in the ancient world, there once rested a tower that was very strategic. And in that tower, there was a man who had a very heavy responsibility. His title was the Watchman. And his role was that when he foresaw danger coming, he had to forewarn the people so that no one would be without excuse. And the Holy Scriptures is the only guide that can safely steer us onto the right course. And in every age, the Most High always raises up watchmen. In the 16th century, both the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge in England produced two very well-learned men who were not seeking any fame, accolades, or popularity, but wanted to enlighten. The first witness in his book, How Are We Complete in Christ? William Whitaker gets to the root of the chaos in this world. And please pay attention, because what he says applies to us all. Quote, corruption, he says, is the great tyrant that has usurped over the whole world. The bounds of its dominion are almost as large as all mankind. There is not a man in all the world, except the first Adam, made after God's image, and the second Adam, who was God as well as man. But he, talking about us, is born a slave or a vassal to this usurper. He continues, the four great successive monarchies in the book of Daniel, that is the Chaldean, the Persian, the Grecian, and the Roman, though the extent of them were great, and the circumference vast, yet were all these limited and bounded, because some parts of the world which knew nothing of their yoke. But alas, the empire of corruption that is in our hearts reaches how far? Every corner of the earth, every single person born into this world. The second witness in his book, Expositions and Notes on Sundry Portions of the Holy Scriptures, William Tyndale gives us the background to the conflict that is now on earth, and our behavior in the 21st century determines who we really serve. And he says, quote, God and the devil are two contrary fathers, he says, two contrary fountains and two contrary causes. the one of all goodness, the other of all evil. And they that do evil are born of the devil. And on the other side, they that do good are first born of God. And as you see in Cain and his brother Abel, so shall it ever continue between the children of God and of the devil. For how long? Unto the world's end. Even the world knows this divine narrative.
I have a proposition. I will give you the earth if you will worship me. Do we have a deal, sir?
Needing to know is what got us banished from the Garden of Eden. Are you prepared to be cast out again, Eve?
Yes.
One day the whole world will hear the Bereshith, the creation worldview, especially as more scientific evidence will solidify the true picture of man's early origins. The ancients preserve man's earliest embryonic beginnings not only in their art, but early Assyriologists like Englishman George Smith knew, as documented in London's Daily Telegraph in 1875, that a man knew from antiquity about the creation and the fall. Since then, man has branched out into different shades of brown according to his geography. But despite these differences on the surface, he is still the same creature. But modern secular science has attempted to falsify and rewrite history to paganize man's thinking, and have been able to convince people that early man was not only backwards, uncivilized, dirty and stupid, but that he has descended from primates, though there is no credible scientific evidence to solidify these claims. Now, true scientists have been able to disprove these claims, and we shall quote just one of them.
In the words of prominent Maryland scientist Benjamin Banneker, if their lives are short, they are merry, noting that they still continue on singing till they die. Benjamin Banneker's original handwritten documents describing the cicadas in 1800 is at the Maryland Center for History and Culture in Baltimore. He accurately predicted the next 17-year cycles. Over the course of his life, he witnessed 4 17-year cycles of cicadas. Benjamin Banneker may have been the first scientist to observe and record the 17-year life cycle of cicadas.
Cicadas are a species of insects that live underground for around 13 to 17 years. Then just emerge out of the ground, make these strange noises, and also live on trees. Now, at the age of 17 years old, Benjamin Banneker in 1747, in his journals, has the oldest non-documented record on the study of this interesting insect. He was a self-taught American naturalist, mathematician, astronomer, landowner, surveyor, and farmer. And though his parents were formerly enslaved black Africans, he seems to have been born free. There are many who say and think that it was him who designed and mapped out Washington, that is the District of Columbia, but that is still an ongoing debate. But he did have an almanac that documented many events in nature, and he also built the very first clock in the United States of America that was made from wood as its structure. So he was a genius. But he wasn't ignorant to racial injustice in a slave state. And he wrote to the 3rd US President and Founding Father, Thomas Jefferson, in response to Jefferson's unscientific, racially biased views in his notes on the state of Virginia, preserved in the US Library of Congress. And coming from a biblical worldview, a small excerpt of it reads, quote, "Our universal Father hath given being to us all, and that he not only made us of one flesh, but that he hath also with partiality afforded us all the sensations and endowed us with all the same faculties, and that however variable we may be in society or religion, however diversified in situation or color, we are all of the same family and stand in the same relation to him." Now we are led to believe that the devices we have today that has accelerated communication and transportation makes us more, and the narrator will put in quotes, more civilized than our forebears in previous generations. But the narrator begs to differ, and he will explain why. In the bending art of Nigeria in West Africa, they discovered that they use a style that has existed from antiquity that continues to this very day. It is called lost wax casting. And they discovered that in Bulgaria, in the Balkans, in Southeast Europe, the oldest known lost wax casting was unearthed with the oldest known gold treasure. And roughly around the same time, in the region today called Pakistan in South Asia, they also have been doing lost wax casting. And this style of metallurgy has been ongoing for how long? Well, according to the journals, 6,000 years. Now, how is man evolving if he has been doing the exact same thing for millennia? The evidence contradicts the theory, and the same technology that NASA uses today is the same technology that was used from antiquity. When you look at a horse drawn from Leonardo da Vinci, the Italian scholar, and a horse carved from France in what has been termed the Ice Age, when curators closely observed the similarities, they documented that in Ice Age art, nothing has changed since then. That's interesting. But the University of Cambridge published a study, and the British newspaper The Daily Mail documented it, and it recalls that man is not evolving, but is shrinking in size. Yes, he has got smaller. And when they compared, as shown in a previous study, a modern human skull and an ancient human skull, and ancient human teeth to modern human teeth, it has been confirmed that man is smaller in stature to his early forebears. But they've also known the skull of modern crocodiles and alligators and ancient beavers in comparison to their successors. Many creatures over time have shrunk, but not all of them. Some have still remained relatively the same size, and the narrator will cite just one example. Our shells are beautifully designed by an artistic creator, and they are worn by different creatures in the animal kingdom, and they come in different shapes and colors. Now, in the narrator's hand is a shell of an aquatic creature that is little known and studied. Scientists or marine biologists are fascinated when they found one on its own in a solitary place in the ocean in Asia. And what makes them unique is that they are a hard species to find. And when you go through the many studies about them in modern scientific journals, they sadly try to fit it within their evolutionary worldview, when they know full well that the evidence says otherwise. And that is called deception. But when you carefully psychoanalyze and filter through their description of the Nautilus, it aligns with the scriptural account. Quote, "The chambered Nautilus," the Washington Post says, "is a lost living relic of an ancient era that has evolved, but has appeared unchanged, like the horseshoe crab, according to what? The fossil record, and has persisted into modern times as a living fossil." Despite the overwhelming evidence that confirms Bereshith, the modern generation through edutainment is being taught falsehoods with another scientific narrative that plays on your emotions but doesn't deliver facts.
Don't see that every day.
Or ever.
Let's go. On the island we're headed to, 24 species have survived there alone.
The theme park owners did experimental work, leaving only the worst ones here.
With the technology of 2D and 3D graphics using CGI, that is computer-generated imagery, films can bring extinct creatures back to life. but they sadly only share half-truths, and they unfairly do not show the full, true picture of the past. So the Bereshith creation model is the clearest and most concise description of the Earth's origins. And before the narrator takes you back to current affairs and its relation to Bible prophecy, he would like to show you what the Earth was once like and how it would be restored in the Earth made new. There is a trend taking place in modern societies of people living, but more so eating healthily and going back to man's original herbivore diet that will be the diet that will be reintroduced in the Earth made new. That was once the diet of the whole of creation, from insects like the ant, the aquatic fish in the ocean, birds in the tree, mammals on the ground, and mammals in the tree. The gastropods like the snails, and the reptiles, the lizards. Now their extinct relatives labeled in the 19th century dinosaurs, most of them were herbivores. This artist's impression and reconstruction of the Falkirus that is found in Utah, USA, was a vegetarian dinosaur. And instead of the scientific community being honest, they falsely claim that it transformed from meat to plants. That is very dishonest. Now scientists are still discovering new species of dinosaurs, specifically in Asia, that is in both Mongolia and in China, but in also other parts of the world. And unlike the dishonesty of Hollywood films, they are admitting that they were herbivores and not carnivores. Now our finite minds will struggle to process that fish that still swim in the ocean once had extinct relatives that were once a lot bigger in size and once swam the depths of the ocean. Can you imagine swimming alongside creatures like that? Not me. Now in London's Natural History Museum on display is an aquatic animal that swims the ocean depths with no fear. It is the sailfish, the fastest creature in the ocean. Can you imagine in the new Earth, this creature that hunts smaller fish will be a herbivore over again? It is very hard for our finite minds to process this, for this is all we have seen. Creatures that are mostly found in Africa were once all over Afro-Eurasia, and this shows that there must have been one global temperature and then some climatic shift took place in the earth that caused these creatures to die out and become extinct. For the rhino, the lion, the hyena, and one of the most dangerous creatures in Africa, the hippo, all once roamed the British Isles in the Northern Hemisphere. Now this is a skeleton of a hippopotamus that was unearthed in Leeds. This is the skull of a rhino found in London. They have also found the jaws of hyenas in Nottinghamshire in the East Midlands, which shows that this laughing mammal once lived in Old Blighty in the Northern Hemisphere in Britain. They have also found the remains of lions and the teeth and tusks of mammoths, also found in the UK. And guess what? This now extinct creature will also be restored in the earth made new, especially as its distant relative, the elephant, is almost becoming extinct on the continent of Africa, another herbivore. Now modern sharks are a lot smaller than their extinct relatives, and in Manchester Museum in northwest England on display are the jaws and teeth of both a modern shark and also its predecessor's tooth, the megalodon. You can see the size of one of its teeth inside the palm of a man's hand. Now both a modern shark and a man can comfortably fit in the jaws of this ancient creature. This will also be restored in the earth made new. In Leeds Museum in West Yorkshire in the north of England, the narrator was also fortunate to see an extinct deer that has been labelled the Irish elk. And this herbivore was once found from Ireland to Siberia. From tip to tip, its antlers spanned 3.5 meters, and this is one of the few full skeletons on display in Britain. Other museums in the UK only have a skull with the antlers, and they are absolutely huge, and they are a lot taller than their successors that roam the plains of Eurasia. But in the earth made new, it shall also be restored. And even though the giraffe in Africa today is the tallest creature on the earth, another creature now extinct, the Passerithium, like the giraffe, another herbivore, once roamed the continent of Asia and was a lot taller than both the giraffe and the elephant. Now all of these creatures will once again live in harmony in the earth made new. But let us come back to the present, and we shall observe the build-up to the earth made new on the prophetic timetable.
Habeas corpus is a legal procedure explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. It allows people to challenge the federal government in court if they've been detained. And one of the president's top aides today, Stephen Miller, confirmed publicly that the White House is exploring this extraordinary step.
Well, the Constitution is clear, and that, of course, is the supreme law of the land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion. So I would say that's an option we're actively looking at.
The United States of America likes to pride itself on its so-called distinct liberties and freedoms. And in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 2 of the Constitution of the United States, it reads, quote, "The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. And who has benefited from it? Well, since the Middle Ages, the New Yorker says, habeas corpus, which means you should have the body, has been the principal means in what? Anglo-American jurisprudence by which prisoners can challenge their incarceration. In habeas corpus proceedings, the government is required to bring a prisoner, that is, the body, before a judge and provide a legal rationale for his continued imprisonment. So habeas corpus was an act that was introduced in 1679 by the English monarch King Charles II, and it is a Latin phrase, as you can see in green, that means you must have the body, according to the Reader's Digest Great Encyclopedic Dictionary. But two writers living in two different centuries, both sporting crossover ties and impeccably dressed, knew of its value. And the first witness, Dr. James Aiken Wiley, said, quote, "The great principle conceded so early as the days of King John in 1215 in the Middle Ages, in Magna Charta, afterwards confirmed in the reign of Charles II in the famous habeas corpus, and held by all statesmen who have flourished since then to be what? One of the main foundations of British liberty, namely the inviolability of the subject save by the authority of law." The second witness, Avraham Manhattan, more or less says the same thing of its lasting benefits, and he said, quote, "The most venerable source of modern democracy in the West was the Magna Charta. With that document, and for the first time, certain basic principles of individual freedom were set forth. These, although very inadequate to our own eyes, were later to become, and please carefully look at the words highlighted in green, the stem from which almost all democratic principles accepted by the West were eventually to blossom." Now, when the narrator has spent years going through Western files and documents, over time he had a light bulb experience and observed that when the Western world talked about freedoms, they're usually referring to how it benefits people of European descent. And when you humbly detach yourself from a deeply Western colonial worldview and embrace a biblical worldview and become a critical thinker, you begin to see the world very differently. And you realize that habeas corpus has only been available to non-Europeans relatively recently. The narrator will explain. The first book the narrator read when he first started high school or secondary school was on the life of the late Steve Biko, a South African activist. So from a pre-teen, the narrator was kind of socially aware of the conditions in South Africa. Now, on a road called Gower Street, just off Euston Road, and just round the corner from Euston Station in the West End of London, the narrator only recently discovered a little-known revolutionary who campaigned against racial injustice in the UK. His name was David Thomas Pitt, a Grenadian-born qualified doctor, whose nieces went to school with the narrator's father in Grenada. The basement of his home, which was his medical practice, was also used for the headquarters of the anti-apartheid movement in the UK. Now, the National Archives in London that houses classified and declassified documents, there is a file that mentions him by Scotland Yard and UK Special Branch, where he was surveillanced for being a black radical in the UK, when he was only addressing racial injustice. But despite these obstacles, he opposed the late Enoch Powell, the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's hero. When in the Labour government, he campaigned for the 1968 Racial Relations Act that stopped discrimination against housing, unemployment and public services. He also opposed the 1968 Immigration Act that blocked East African Indians from entering the UK. He became the chairman of the British Medical Association, a registered trade union for doctors in the United Kingdom. And he also became the chairman for Shelter, the registered charity that helps the homeless and campaigns for housing justice in England and Wales. But in his obituary in the Independent newspaper, his colleague, the late Joan Lester, said that as a pioneer in the anti-apartheid movement, he lent us his basement of his Gower Street surgery for our headquarters. There was also another Caribbean who campaigned against the injustices of apartheid in South Africa, and he was the Guyanese British singer Eddie Grant, and his song Give Me Hope Jana was like an anthem in 1988 within the British Caribbean community. Very few knew that he was addressing the injustices of apartheid, but one man tried to sample his song without giving him credit, and guess who that was? President Donald Trump. And Trump used one of Eddie Grant's songs, probably on a campaign trail, and didn't pay Eddie Grant his royalties. So Eddie Grant took Donald Trump to court, sued him, and guess what? He won the case. But what does Donald Trump have to do with post-apartheid South Africa? The businessman and president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, was invited to the White House in the United States by President Donald Trump in late May 2025. With the US administration filled with apartheid children, a narrative was presented to the public that there is a genocide taking place of white South African farmers, like, the Coney 2012 scam. But even whites in South Africa clicked and knew something wasn't quite right. And when it was closely observed, it was unearthed that though whites, who make about 9% of the population of South Africa, they still control 75%, that is around 3/4 of agricultural and farm land. The police report of South Africa showed that blacks, whites, coloureds and Asians of all ages and genders are all affected by crime, and that economic conditions have not drastically changed since the fall of the apartheid government. Now, it is fair to say that many blacks have benefited from the post-Mandela era, but under the Anglo-American Israeli-backed South African apartheid regime, habeas corpus did not apply to blacks in the Protestant-run state. And a few black intellectuals picked up on this. And in a book titled Black Skin, White Mass, the late French-speaking intellectual Frantz Fanon, when closely psychoanalyzing apartheid South Africa, he said, quote, "Apartheid aspires to banish the Negro from participating in modern history as a free and independent force. Under the Act for Native Administration, the Governor General, as the supreme authority, has autocratic powers over the Africans. By proclamation, he may arrest and detain any African deemed dangerous to public order. He may forbid meetings of more than 10 persons in any native residential area." This sounds like the Inquisition. "And the writ of habeas corpus is not available to Africans. Mass arrests without warrant are made constantly." Now, why is this history little known? Well, Mr. George Orwell said they will manipulate the narrative by controlling the past, omitting vital data so that you'll suffer with deep amnesia, having no idea what is taking place in the present. As a result of deleting the past, then you will not know how to prepare for the future. Interesting. In the south of England, there are monuments dedicated to the Magna Carta that both Dr. Wiley and Avram Manhattan said was the pillar of Western freedoms. There are also a few original copies of the Magna Carta, and one of them is on display in London's British Library, a testimony to a deep-rooted struggle for human liberty. Now, it was in the reign of the 17th century Stuart monarch Charles II that habeas corpus was instituted. But with his younger brother James II, Duke of York, habeas corpus was only available to a privileged few in a certain environment. In London's Bank of England Museum, which has a very good history of English currency, there is a gold coin with an image of King Charles II, and the currency was named after Guinea, the West African region it came from. And both Charles II on the left and James, Duke of York on the right, created the Royal African Company with merchants from the City of London to use and abuse black bodies from Africa without pay to boost up the economic fortunes of the British Empire. Now, in a book titled The Negro and the Nation, the very anti-religious West Indian American Hubert Harrison documented why they replaced Amerindian slave labor in the New World with black bodies. And he said, quote, "The African slave trade was born of the desire of certain Europeans to acquire wealth. How? Without working. It was to fill the need for a cheap labor supply in developing new territory that Negro slaves were first brought to the Western world by the Spanish, Dutch, and the English, and the Portuguese and the French during the 16th and 17th centuries. Contact of white with black was thus established on what? The basis of the economic subjection of the one to the other. This subjection extended to every sphere of life: physical, mental, and social." First witness. In another book titled Negroes and Indians Advocate for Their Admission into the Church, this 17th century Anglican missionary, Morgan Godwin, observing the same thing, said, quote, "Slaves were subject to the English such as most of the Negroes. The English, by the inducement and instigation of our planters' chief deity, is not God, but what? Profit. And our neighbours of Holland, whose religion is also governed not by the Bible, but by their trade." Second witness. So when scholars have carefully combed through files in the archives of Western history, they stumble across something interesting that is downplayed. Habeas corpus very, very rarely applied to blacks in the colonies in the Americas, and in a very interesting case that some say has been wrongly titled Somerset against Stuart. One of the very few and rare abolitionists in England, Granville Sharp, a philanthropist, was able to protect a free man from being put back or sent to a plantation in the Americas, for on British soil he was a free man, and he used, that is Granville Sharp, habeas corpus to protect this black African man that was able to let this man to remain a free citizen on English soil. So if habeas corpus was denied to blacks in the colonies, what were the conditions like? The autobiographical narratives of these slaves are shown in previous studies, Peter Randolph at the back, Frederick Douglass on the left, and Austin Stroud on the right, describe the conditions on those plantations as horrific. Now in both North America and in the Caribbean, slaves were hunted down by dogs because they were seen as nothing more than animals. Thomas Thistlewood, an English-born slave owner, boasted in his diaries in Jamaica that he would repeatedly rape his slave women and torture the men. And this torture started for when they arrived on the ships, where young teenage girls were degraded on them on the plantations. The woman in Dutch Suriname on the left and the man from the southern states on the right were both subject to horrific torture. Now, two historians described the conditions at that time, and the first witness, Adam Smith, said, quote, "In all European colonies, the culture of the sugarcane is carried on by Negro slaves. The blacks, indeed, who make the greater part of the inhabitants of the southern colonies in the United States, upon the continent, and of the West India Islands, as are in a state of slavery, are no doubt in a worse condition than the poorest people either in Scotland or in Ireland." The second witness was an African, and Olaud Ekiano could not believe what he saw with his own eyes when he said, quote, "While I was thus employed by my master, I was often a witness of cruelties of every kind which were exercised on my unhappy fellow slaves. It was almost a constant practice with our clerks and other whites to commit violent depredations on the chastity of female slaves. Today we call it rape. I have even known them gratify their brutal passion with females not yet 10 years old. By the reported cruelties are the wretched murdered, and in the West Indies they cut and mangle the slaves in a shocking manner on the most trifling occasions, and altogether treat them in every respect like brutes. So when habeas corpus is denied, the worst cruelties can take place. But today, revisionists are trying to downplay that episode of history.
There's an argument that's made because it's a huge slavery literature that actually American slaves, they live very well compared to those in the Caribbean.
Oh Lord. As George Orwell brilliantly penned when he forewarned us about the revisionists, they will rewrite history, alter your memory of the past, so you will not understand what is taking place in the present and will have no idea of what is being planned for the future. So why is the Atlantic slave trade very important to study? Well, because every surveillance method that you see today can be traced back to those horrific plantations. Let us briefly look at the present before we go back into the past. Now, AI is sweeping the modern digital landscape, and though it has its benefits and has infiltrated into our everyday lives without most of us being aware of it, it is estimated that most people's jobs within the next 5 years, well, not plumbers, will be obsolete as a result of AI. Now, the narrator is aware that covering wars is not encouraging at all, but it is important to see how AI is playing a role in modern warfare. The narrator has already covered in a previous study in the Ukraine that US tech giants have turned it into an AI war lab. That's disgusting. And critics have observed that Israel, whose support also comes from the US tech community, as already shown early in the study, critics have observed that it has gone too far, way beyond the laws of ethics. But very little is known about the most mineral-rich region on the earth, the continent of Africa, where it has never had a break from being a colonial testing ground for imperial powers. Now, protests are taking place on that continent because of the disinformation of imagery as a result of AI. AI has also manipulated the conflict in the Sahel in the Sahara, and it has been described as the region with the most terror deaths than the rest of the world combined. Mark Zuckerberg's Meta is being sued for Facebook posts being used for provoking the bloody conflict in Ethiopia that killed innocent and led to a mass exodus of people. Now, the Red Sea has been considered as one of the most strategic sea lanes on the earth, and many nations want to monopolize on its fortunes. Now, the United States and China both have naval bases in that region, but more recently Russia has got a footing in that region and has also acquired a naval base in that area, but at what cost? From this 15th century BC painting in the British Museum up to this very day, Sudan is just filled with gold, and that gold is being plundered not just by Russia to boost its war effort in the Ukraine, but also by the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, who produces plenty of oil but no gold. And she is also financing and fueling the war in the Sudan, which she is trying to deny. And though it is a highly ignored war that affects 3 continents, Iran is also supplying weapons that is fueling that conflict. But so is US technology. It has been discovered that AI can steal our voice, and there is nothing we can do about it. But in the Sudan, they have discovered that AI is also fueling the war in the Sudan, where they use voice cloning tech of the ousted leader in the Sudan. There's also a man in his late 30s who the black community around the world is cheering on, but the Western world sees him as a threat. Why is that? Well, his name is Captain Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso, who has modeled himself after his assassinated predecessor and hero Thomas Sankara. It has been estimated that he has had 18 assassination attempts. And when you pose that much of a threat to Western foreign interests, it should not be a surprise that there are so many AI deepfake videos and music videos circling on the web about him. Now, the narrator believes, and he could be wrong, that there's something sinister at play. But with his voice being cloned for viral videos, it is already clear that famous people, especially within the black community like Kendrick Lamar, are giving us a picture of what they can do with either a photo or a video clip of anybody, and they can mimic you on how they please, make you look either older or younger, and convince the world that it is actually you.
25 years ago, your father took my blood and he cloned me. He made you from me. He chose me because there's never been anybody like me, and he knew one day I was going to get old and then you'd step in. He's been lying to you the whole time. He told you you were an orphan. And of all the people in the world to come after me, why would he send you? Because I'm the best. You are obviously not the best.
Now, these tech companies who are manipulating the global battlefields, sales in stock boosted when they joined President Donald Trump in his Middle East tour. And Dr. Alex Karp, the co-founder and CEO and director of Palantir Technologies, was one of those tech giants whose bank accounts swelled during those trade deals. Now, there are very few people who are familiar with this company. They are more focused on Google being the world's top information gatherer. But Palantir was founded with CIA money, so it is a part of the intelligence community. And it has recently come under fire as of January 2025, even by its own staff members, as being a staunch ally of President Donald Trump to gather data on all American citizens. But not them only. We have seen that the United States has infiltrated the communities of the Amazon jungle. But now anyone across the world who plans to visit the United States of America, once you step into their borders, you may be asked for your mobile cell phone and its passwords. And what will happen to anyone who is speaking against US foreign policy or President Donald Trump? Well, as a French scientist recently discovered, when his phone was found with critical messages of the president, he was denied entry. And this is the trajectory or path the United States is careering into. But what is the connection to Habeas corpus?
A federal judge ordered the release of a Tufts University student in the country on a student visa and then detained by ICE after she wrote an opinion piece in the college paper that was critical of the Israel and Gaza war.
The Trump administration is weighing whether to suspend habeas corpus for immigrants here illegally. It's a constitutional right that lets people challenge unlawful detention.
Now at 11, chaos erupts as armed federal agents conduct sweeping immigration raids across Los Angeles. Good evening, I'm Micah Ullman.
And I'm Cher Calvin. Dozens were arrested during the sweep as angry protesters clashed with federal agents on the streets of downtown LA.
The surprise raids took place this morning, but the chaos continues into the night as hundreds face off with police. It all began at a Home Depot and then in LA's Garment District as federal agents used flashbang grenades to clear the protesters who were trying to disrupt the operation, targeting undocumented workers.
When a few people have been closely observing these ICE raids of immigrants, outside of the emotional hype and euphoria, they observed that within each generation a new target or enemy is created. But this brutal behavior by law enforcement has been ongoing for several hundred years, and the California-Mexico Studies Center observed that there are echoes of the Fugitive Slave Act in today's Immigration Act. Now, what was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850? Well, in the United States, men would queue up in their droves and they would buy black people at auctions because blacks were not citizens but property before the Emancipation Proclamation. And this was the revenue that financed many different industries in the United States. The unpaid labor of black bodies. But many slaves who could not handle being dehumanized fled either to Canada in the north or to Mexico in the south. So the government created the precursor to the US Police Department called the Slave Patrol, where both citizens and a hired militia would hunt down runaway black slaves and return them to their masters. And the modern ID system that the Department of Homeland Security wants to eventually enforce nationwide is the successor of the slave pass that slaves had to carry with them when they traveled into other plantations. And if any of these slaves are caught without an ID, the brutal method imported from the Caribbean island of Barbados was torture, like the Inquisition. Now, this system still continued even into modern times.
And unfortunately, some of us, black people who were in position to make changes, were pawns of white people and did not. For example, I don't want to say anything that will make you liable, but I think I can prove all of this. General B.O. Davis was sent down to a camp in the Deep South. I don't remember which one now. So the constant barrage of letters from the parents of servicemen, the wives and sweethearts of servicemen who were in that camp and living under the most incredibly bad conditions. If a black woman, check this out, went down to this to visit her son or her boyfriend or her husband, she was required by the town authorities to carry a pass. If she were stopped without the pass, she was subject to arrest on charges of prostitution.
But what may shock people even more is that these fugitive slave laws did not actually start with blacks. For Hubert Henry Harrison said, quote, "Most people will be surprised to learn that the first fugitive slave law was framed not in the South, but in the North, and was made not for black, but for white laborers. This was the Massachusetts Act of 1630, called Respecting Masters, Servants and Laborers. A reading of this one act would destroy all those pretty illusions or fake history about our father's freedom, which we get from the official fairy tales, the school histories. But there is another community in the United States who are also seeing history repeat itself, for they were once demonized and marginalized and isolated from mainstream society during the Second World War. And when they see certain groups targeted by the US government, the trauma and wounds of that relived experience comes back to haunt them.
Some among them were potentially dangerous.
Dorothea was asked to photograph the evacuation of the Japanese Americans, and her feelings were very different.
If we didn't have these photographs, this story would be a blip in U.S. history.
You know, people look back and they say, well, these things can't happen again, but I don't believe that.
Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States.
It's the same kind of sweeping, generalized characterization of a group of people. Right after Pearl Harbor, the soldiers came to get us.
Now, the narrator purchased a book titled Impounded a number of years ago that was about the late documentary photographer Dorothy Lange. This woman was famous for her imagery of the effects of poverty during the Great Depression of the United States in the 1930s. But President Franklin Delano Roosevelt hired her to photograph the Japanese American community, who were labeled as a domestic threat in the United States during the Second World War in the 1940s. And if it wasn't for her photography, as one man said, there would be no documented pictographic records of those Japanese internment camps in North America. As the United States and the rest of the Western world has a track record of cleverly covering up their crimes against humanity. But there was still a deeper, longer history to this episode in the United States. Previously, when Chinese workers were stationed in California, anti-Chinese imagery started to appear in American media. But they weren't the first to feel the anti-immigration hostility.
Now, son, who's that?
Saint Michael.
Who is it?
Saint Michael.
And what did he do?
He cast Satan out of paradise.
Good boy.
On my challenge, we have met at this chosen ground.
The earth turns.
To settle for who holds sway over the 5 points.
But we don't feel it move.
Us natives or the foreign hordes defiling it.
That war is 1,000 years old and more. We never expected it to follow us here.
This will all be finished tomorrow.
No, it won't.
On your order, Val.
When the Irish flooded the shores of the United States from Europe in the 19th century as a result of the potato famine, though they were white Europeans, they were not embraced with outstretched arms, but were viewed with suspicion as a Catholic threat to that so-called Protestant nation. And in the Diocese of New York under Archbishop John Joseph Hughes, the Irish-born Catholic prelate, If the testimony of Charles Chiniquy, the former French Catholic Canadian priest, can be relied upon, the Irish led the biggest insurrection in US history, called the 1863 Draft Riots of New York, where the Irish revolted against the forced conscription to fight for the Union Army during the US Civil War. They were angry for they were viewed on the same level as blacks, at times even seen as lower than blacks. And this led to innocent blacks being attacked and sometimes lynched on the streets of New York by angry Irish mobs. And even black orphanages with innocent children were also attacked, for the Irish felt dehumanized and took out their rage on innocent black people. Now, the US government had to bring in the National Guard to intervene to quiet the riot. And it was not until the 1930s that the Irish were officially allowed to be categorized as, guess what? White people. But very recently, also a jewel in the crown Western apologist was to get a reality check that America is run on certain embedded cultural lines, as the Irish were also to find out.
So, Anne, thanks for coming on, and I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Me too. Thanks for having me. That was a fantastic opening monologue. I too am a fan of yours. So I'm going to make a point of disagreeing with you so that it will be fun. You are so bright and articulate, and I guess I can call you articulate since you're not an American black. Can't say that about them. That's derogatory. And that was a great opening segment. Lots of things to talk about there. Oh, and I agreed with many, many things you said during, in fact, probably more than most other candidates when you were running for president. But I still would not have voted for you because you're an Indian. You know, Hitler had soup. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have soup. Mm-hmm. Hitler loved dogs. That doesn't mean you shouldn't love dogs. So I think we have to move past this. If Hitler did it, it must be bad.
Yeah.
I'd also point out that the only people who are not allowed to be proud of their ethnic group do tend to be Anglo-Saxons. Oh boy, you can't be proud of being white. There is a core national identity that is the identity of the WASP. And that doesn't mean we can't take anyone else in, a Sri Lankan or a Japanese or an Indian. But the core around which the nation's values are formed is the WASP. We've never had a president who didn't have at least partial English ancestry. Never.
Though Trump 2.0 is of German and Scottish descent, he still dances to the tune of the WASP structure. And though the suspension of Habeas corpus looks like a brand new agenda for US foreign policy, it is a continuation of a system. For the Japanese Americans in the internment camps during the Second World War were not allowed the privilege of Habeas corpus. They were denied that Anglo-American human right. And the London Guardian documented that the writ of Habeas corpus has only been suspended, how many times? Not including the Japanese Americans, 4 times in US history, most notably by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. It was also suspended during the efforts to fight the Ku Klux Klan in the 19th century in South Carolina, in the Philippines in Southeast Asia in 1905, and in Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean, a US state, after Pearl Harbor. Though the Japanese Americans felt the isolation from mainstream US society, they admitted that even when they were classified as enemy combatants, there was still another group of people who were still mistreated worse than them.
But I also saw poverty in Arkansas and Jim Crow. My father rode on a bus and he was told to sit with the white people, and he couldn't sit in the back of the bus. And he came back to camp saying, I'm an enemy alien. I should be in jail. And yet they treat me better than they treat the people who live here. He thought it was incredible that that was going on in the United States. He never saw that before in his life.
Men of the 24th Infantry. This is Texas. Things are a little different down here in the South. I will expect you men to obey the racial code.
Yes, sir. Jim Crow's the law. Respect it.
What are we gonna do? The police brutalize us, sir. All we want is to be treated as soldiers.
As military police, you are to ensure order.
What do we do, sir?
William, I've done all I can do here.
We have a problem. We're gonna take our country back.
Law run this town.
There's a militia on the way.
Are they?
Which way did they go?
Keep pushing people down. Sooner or later, they rise up.
Fire!
Can you identify any of the leaders of the mutiny?
In the year 2023, the US Army cleared the names of 110 black soldiers who were unfairly sentenced to death in the 1917 Houston race riots. In defending themselves from the unfair, unconstitutional Jim Crow laws in the South, martial law was declared in that racial upheaval, and known as the largest murder trial in the history of the United States. These black soldiers of North America were criminalized, denied the right of Habeas corpus, and instead received, like the Lincoln assassins, a military tribunal. A very sad episode in US history. But guess what? It is creeping back again. And once it dominates the shores of the United States, they will eventually enforce it worldwide, and Hollywood always forewarns us of what's to come.
Stopped, and there's only one way to do that.
Are you saying the president is prepared to take the necessary steps?
Today, with the invocation of the War Powers Act by the President, I am declaring a state of martial law in this city. We intend to seal off this borough
And put soldiers on the street and have Americans looking over their shoulders. Bend the law, shred the Constitution just a little bit.
Secretary Noem, the White House Deputy Chief of Staff recently said that the Trump administration is actively looking at suspending habeas corpus. Last week you were asked about this, and I want to clarify your position because it's obviously really important to get this right. So, Secretary Noem, what is habeas corpus?
Well, habeas corpus is a constitutional right that the president has to be able to remove people from this country and suspend their right to.
Let me stop you, ma'am. Habeas corpus, excuse me, that's incorrect.
President Lincoln used it.
Excuse me. Habeas corpus is the legal principle that requires that the government provide a public reason for detaining and imprisoning people. If not for that protection, the government could simply arrest people, including American citizens, and hold them indefinitely for no reason. Habeas corpus is the foundational right that separates free societies like America from police states like North Korea. As a senator from the Live Free or Die state, this matters a lot to me and my constituents and to all Americans. So, Secretary Noem, do you support the core protection that habeas corpus provides, that the government must provide a public reason in order to detain and imprison someone?
Yeah, I support habeas corpus. I also recognize that the President of the United States has the authority under the Constitution to decide if it should be suspended or not.
It has never
Let us be clear, though,
it has never been done. It has never been done without approval of Congress. Even Abraham Lincoln got retroactive approval from Congress.
There are many who think that the current Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America is on an uncontrolled wild crusade, but they are unaware that they are looking at a system and not an individual who is repeating history.
Make America great again.
Now, the Heritage Foundation is one of the many homegrown institutions in the United States of America that has an influence on domestic policy in the United States. While it is still relatively unknown, very few are unaware that it has a history of influencing elected US presidents, attempting to promote conservative ideals that on the surface look moral and upright, but sadly harm the disadvantaged. What was attempted with President Ronald Reagan and failed miserably with homegrown grassroots pressure has now been accomplished with President Donald Trump. So this agenda that has been in the pipeline for a generation seems like it is accomplishing its goals, and whole departments and careers are going to suffer tremendously. Now, this is in a country where, according to the Guardian newspaper, 500 deaths a day are from poverty as a result of the fourth leading cause of death in the United States. And men like Eric Prince, who worked with the first Trump administration, has now been reinstated to work in the second administration. And the disgusting but now downplayed and overlooked collateral damage his mercenary government contractors Blackwater did in Iraq was horrific. Now, what would happen again if you were to unleash these rebranded thugs into the American cities? Well, listen to what this medieval historian had to say. Quote, "Mercenaries," the infamous Niccolo Machiavelli said, "are ambitious, undisciplined, disloyal, and they quarrel among themselves. Courageous with friends and cowardly with enemies, they have no fear of God and keep no promises." Interesting. Now, with the commander-in-chief having complete control over the military, who's attempting to undo constitutional rights by challenging Congress and the Supreme Court, with a solid religious backing by the churches, and full collaboration with the now dominant tech community, many can see where this is going. And in a book titled Behind the Dictators, published in 1942, the late Irish historian Leo Lehman and former Catholic priest said, quote, "Corporatism, which is a few companies having a whole monopoly over industries, is indeed the economic ingredient of fascism. But it is also the essential element of fascism, since the corporative make a parliament or a congress what? Unnecessary. For these cooperatives are the means through which the leader exercises his dictatorial will." The entire ideology of fascism in social, number 1, economic, number 2, educational, number 3, religious, number 4, and military matters, number 5, is contained in the corporate system. Corporatism is fascism. Now, the fascist corporative state objective is to do what? Discredit and destroy what? The structure of the liberal democratic state, and to replace it with what? And set up in its stead authoritarian, hierarchical regimes on what? Catholic fascist lines, or in terms of the United States, an image to the beast.
The military parade for Trump's birthday has all the earmarks of a dictatorship.
There is civil unrest planned across the country today. Several protests planned here in the New York area as well. Now, No King's Day is branded by organizers as a day of defiance. They say Mr. Trump's presidency has been used to attack the arts, universities, and democracy. These demonstrations are happening as ICE raids continue across the country.
Whether they're fascists or communists, authoritarians are people who believe that violence is a way you change history, thus revolutions and coups, and violence is a way you solve differences. It's a new kind of coup because his digital shock troops, who now have physical power, to lock out our elected representatives, as happened to Maxwell Frost, to representative from Florida, and others.
Now, the role of the watchman on the tower is to forewarn people of what is to come or any oncoming danger. He has to be sharp and always alert and cannot sleep on the job. He is not meant to argue with people, debate, or get drawn into drama or conflicts. He is not meant to seek any fame or accolades or credibility, for it is a lonely role. And when you have the divine prophetic compass guiding you on the right direction, you'll always be one step ahead of the rest of the world in global affairs. Throughout this study, the narrator has shown that throughout its short-lived history, the United States has always been that dragon-speaking beast of Revelation chapter 13 verses 11 to 18. She does not qualify as a Christian nation, and the narrator will explain why later on in this study. Now, today's new school of geopolitical analysts believe that the rise of the technocratic state, the People's Republic of China, is going to overthrow and outsmart the United States of America. But boy, are they in for a shock and a surprise. For the oldest known system on the earth, known in political circles as the Holy See, in prophetic circles as the papacy, how does this religio-political power see China? Does she view her as a threat? Well, a high Vatican official, Bishop Marcelo Sanchez Soranto, said to the Catholic media that China is a model of Roman Catholic social teaching. So this state is a model of the papacy, because this surveillance state with the highest number of CCTV cameras than anywhere else on the entire earth, where people order with facial recognition, is a model of how papal-controlled Europe was in the Middle Ages. So yes, you can study China to see a model of how the rest of the entire world will eventually operate, but she is not a prophetic power. The narrator will share the two methods he uses to identify the systems. He follows a very old school biblical method whereby the more you study and read it, the more you identify with its divine author and become familiar with who he is, so that it will be very difficult for you to get deceived. And in a book titled Disputations on the Holy Scriptures, when the narrator purchased this book either in 2001 or 2002, the best Western biblical scholar, in the narrator's humble opinion, said, quote, "The Old and New Testaments do, by their mutual testimony, establish and consign each other. For no saving truth can be known without who? The Holy Spirit. For the Holy Spirit is the author of faith and not the church." Amen. John 5:39, where Christ says, "Search the scriptures, and salvation may be derived from the scriptures," then everything is contained where? In the scriptures. In Luke chapter 24 and verse 45, we read that Christ opened the minds of the apostles that they might understand the scriptures. Once we perceive that faith springs from a right of understanding what? The scriptures. The church is not the rule, but a thing directed by the rule. The scripture itself is the rule of faith, for the voice of the church ought to be governed by what? Scripture. And the church is the effect of faith and therefore cannot be the rule. For the church is the multitude of the faithful and therefore ought to be governed by what? Faith. To follow faith, to depend upon the rule of faith and adjust all things by it. But the voice of the church is an act of the church and posterior to the church. The voice of the church is the voice of men, but the rule of faith is the voice of God. Now, in the interesting narrative of Olaudah Equiano, this Nigerian Igbo also confirms that the personal study of the Word of God will protect you against deception. And he said, quote, "Now the Bible was my only companion and comfort. I prize it much, with many thanks to God that I could read it." How? For myself. And was, and look at the words highlighted in green, not left to be tossed about to and fro or led by man's devices and notions. So once you read the Word of God for yourself, it is very, very difficult for any minister or church institution to either manipulate you or deceive you. Now, if you were to ask your average person in the West, what subject did they despise the most while they were at school? Most of them would often say history, because the teacher, whether male or female, just offloaded onto the pupils historical data that the average person did not see its relevance. But the narrator has learned that the historical files of the past are very important. For if you don't understand the past, it will repeat itself over again in front of your very eyes. So the narrator will teach you how he researches and analyzes history. He'll give one example. The 1994 French film Queen Margot, as shown in previous studies, is about the horrific bloodbath and ethnic cleansing of Protestants in France, the August 1572 infamous Saint Bartholomew's massacre. The narrator has learned the best method to research that horrific event by going to the data of that day. Now, in the British Museum on the main floor, there are 2 coins, and in the center, one is of Pope Gregory XV, glorifying the massacre. So it was praised in Catholic circles. Now, this painting of the massacre was by a French Protestant Huguenot, and the massacre started with the assassination of Gaspard de Coligny, the French Protestant nobleman and admiral of France. But there were eyewitnesses also of that massacre, such as Englishman Francis Walsingham, the father of modern-day intelligence, who witnessed the massacre from his window in the English embassy in France, and French historian Jacques-Auguste Dethou, and Joseph Justus Scaliger, who had to flee France to escape the massacre. So if you want to be a credible historian, you have to go back to the files of that day. But sadly, as George Orwell said, revisionists are going to alter the past so you cannot understand what is going on in the present. And in the Anglo-American intellectual world, there has been an ongoing agenda even before the narrator was born to ever so cleverly cover up the colonial crimes of the West. And when you ever so cleverly distort history, you can cleverly present that you are the victims when it is convenient. Then also present yourself as the civilizers and heroes of mankind when it is only a clever, conniving cover-up.
It is Eurocentric in the sense that it's Christian. It's a Christian idea that one man and one woman leave their families, cling together, and what God has united, let no man separate. There are plenty of other countries all around the world that you can have 10 wives, 20 wives, out of wedlock.
If we look across history, slavery is about as universal a human institution as agriculture or marriage, frankly. Why are the countries who led the way in abolishing it, at great cost, in the case of the United States, at great human cost, 600,000 Americans dead in a gruesome civil war that completely ripped the country apart?
Now, these two men have a Thomas Carlyle worldview that Occult identified as WASP. It is a racialized hero worship narrative that falsely claims that modern white Europeans are the true civilizers, saviors, inventors, and liberators of all of mankind. And they have also cleverly Europeanized salvation and Jesus Christ by discrediting non-European communities. For if you look at most, if not all, of biblical films, you will observe that the Western world has always made biblical characters look like Europeans and not like the people of the Orient in the Middle East, so that people will always look at Europeans as God's true chosen people. Sadly, many blacks, in order to find an identity also in race and not in the Lord, have stooped to their level and have also racialized salvation, also falsely claiming that they are also God's true chosen people on the earth, and some are very aggressive with it. Both of these tribes are ignorant to the fact that Jesus Christ died for all nations and none is to be neglected. You see, no nation is to be overlooked in the plan of salvation. And if you daily drink from the fountain of the Holy Scriptures and humble yourself, it should break down your deep-rooted cultural prejudices. When you read the Holy Scriptures, God does not look on our outward appearance, but on our hearts. For not only is archaeology continuing to prove that both the Old and the New Testaments are accurate, but as the narrator showed in the previous study on deception and in other studies, Holy Scriptures recorded Sargon II, the Assyrian king from Asia, who's documented in Isaiah chapter 20 and verse 1. Taharqa, the black African Nubian king of the Sudan, who also ruled the 25th dynasty of Egypt, also documented in Isaiah chapter 37 and verse 9. And Tiberius Caesar, the Roman monarch of Europe, who was documented in Luke chapter 3 and verse 1. So Afro-Eurasian kingdoms are represented, and in the pre-Constantine world, before Christianity was paganized, God's true church was scattered throughout the whole of Afro-Eurasia. For all the languages of all nations can celebrate the death of Christ, says William Whitaker. And Irenaeus, the 2nd century AD bishop in Lib 1c.3 says that in his time, churches were found where? In the East, in Asia, that is in the Orient, in Libya and in Egypt, in Africa, that is in the global South, and in Spain, Germany and Gaul, that is in Europe, in the Occident, in the West. Harding, Article 3, Section 38 writes that Armenians, Russians, Ethiopians, Dalmatians and Muscovites read the scriptures in their own vernacular tongue. William Whitaker continues and says that God is no respecter of persons, for he looks upon the children of men with another kind of eye than man is used to do. Whether our outward condition be high or mean, there is nothing of privilege or disadvantage from hence in respect of salvation. Another student of Oxford University reinforces this divine standard, and Morgan Godwin also says, quote, "Man was made, why? Well, namely to glorify and serve God, which right was not superinduced as an additional supply of any imaginary defects of his creation. It was first planted and formed in him. For we are all the children of God by faith in Christ Jesus." And look at the words highlighted in green, unto which neither condition, country, complexion, nor descent can be any impediment, says the second witness. So if you look at the world through God's divine lens, you will see people as people. But unfortunately, that is not the current standard of the West. Now, this Englishman makes the claim that from 1861 to 1865, men of European descent in North America sacrificed their lives to abolish slavery. Oh Lord. Let us carefully unpack this revisionist narrative. The New York Times has digitized its archive with documents from that time, and there was a debate in the UK Parliament among MPs on the origins of that war. And one of the many articles was titled "The American Question in Parliament," as the UK depended upon American cotton that the slaves picked. But please carefully listen to this debate in UK Parliament. Quote, "It was said that the North Americans cared nothing about slavery, and that the present war did not originate out of any feeling on that subject. In the North, there was not perhaps one person out of 10 who desired to see it abolished." Interesting. As to the cause of the Civil War, the suppression of slavery had very little to do with it. If it had, perhaps the people of the North would have received more sympathy from the people of this country in the UK. Now, the assassinated US President Abraham Lincoln has been lionized as a hero and a liberator of the slaves. But if you carefully read the Lincoln-Douglas 1858 debate, he did not see black people as his equals. When he passed the Emancipation of Proclamation of 1862, it only freed a few slaves in a few states, and he compensated all these slave owners and gave them reparations for the fortunes that they lost. And he wanted to deport all the blacks out of America so it could remain a white nation. And declassified documents are showing that he not only wanted to send them back to Africa, but he wanted to resettle them in different colonies in the Caribbean. This is all in contradiction of the revisionist history that we are taught about him. This is why his successors are still praising his domestic policy. So the New York Times confirmed that during the last presidential election, the word slavery was used as a mere political cry for party purposes. In his inaugural address, President Lincoln declared, "I have no intention to interfere directly or indirectly in the question of slavery where it exists. I do not think I have the right to do so illegally, and I am by no means inclined to do it." Such was the policy of not only Mr. Lincoln, but the majority of his cabinet, and they acted upon it. But this revisionist history hasn't ceased. Anti-DEI Peter Hegseth was appointed by President Trump as the United States Secretary of Defense, who is another revisionist who likes to purge history. His pastor, Douglas Wilson, a conservative, reformed and evangelical theologian, is also a revisionist, for he co-wrote a booklet titled Southern Slavery, as it was that falsely claimed that slavery promoted affection between the races in where? The South. But that's not what the blacks thought. In the memoirs of General Sherman, the Secretary of War, he interviewed 20 black Baptist and Methodist ministers. And this is what their spokesman, Garrison Fraser, said, quote, "Fourth question. State in what manner you would rather live, whether scattered among the whites or in colonies by yourselves." He responded, "Answer. I would prefer to live by ourselves, for there is a prejudice against us in where? The South. That will take how long? Years to get over. But I do not know that I can answer for my brethren." So this is why the narrator studies the original files of the day. For though slavery was abolished 2 centuries ago, the deep-rooted attitudes still remain in the hearts of the plantation owners' descendants. And if they are defending the crimes of their forefathers, once these current temporal liberties are removed, like Habeas corpus, they will reenact these crimes against humanity on an even worse scale when the United States of America enforces globally the mark of the beast, the image of the beast, the name of the beast, and the number of his name.
Okay, so you've been here for about just over 2 hours. And I know this is a lot of information to take in, so if you want to, just take a break. Okay, the break over? Okay, let's continue. So we're going to look at the United States of America, slavery, and the effect it has on race. So within this last hour, observe, analyze, and still continue to research every single thing that you see.
We are laser focused on our mission of warfighting.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end, and perhaps most importantly, the wars we never get into. It's called peace through strength.
You look into the eyes of these young Americans who are giving up the best years of their life in a uniform to serve their nation. They are incredible.
Through our power and might, we will lead the world to peace. Our friends will respect us, our enemies will fear us, and the whole world will admire the unrivaled greatness of the United States military.
So while America is flexing its muscles, making an openly bold statement to the whole world, especially through her long history of propaganda in her militarized Pentagon-backed films that she is a dominant global power, something else has been brewing for years that will make the entire world eventually unconsciously yield to this system. For as William Tyndale said, the majority of the world are going to either follow God or the path of Cain, and most of the world will follow Cain. And many individuals are trekking around the world to explore ancient cultures in order to encounter a kind of ayahuasca spiritual experience. And there is a resurgence or a revival of ancient occultic practices. But in this search for a lost spiritual identity that was forfeited at Eden, there is one belief that has stood the stress of time, that has even infiltrated and penetrated itself into church or Christian theology. And the narrator remembers that when he was in college, this woman came into the church through this music video called The Crossroads by the US rap group called Bone Thugs and Harmony. The song incorporated a belief that started at Eden and continues to this very day. And the British intelligence officer who was critiqued for not thoroughly investigating the Jack the Ripper case, Sir Robert Anderson, said, quote, "The natural immortality of man that man sadly fell for in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 4, we are told is a theory of heathen philosophers engrafted upon Christianity when in post-apostolic days." So when the narrator watches many videos of Christians who have turned into atheists, as they were never taught about the first or second resurrections, they were deceived in the belief system of the immortality of the soul. But it is opening another door. In a book titled Chaldean Magic and Astrology, the 19th century French Assyriologist Francois Lenormand gives us a picture of what men are running back to. Quote, "All magic rests upon a system of religious belief and upon a fixed conception of that supernatural world that is connected with the worship of elementary spirits to conjure the spirits. Such is the religion of all the black nations, of the Altaic tribes, the colonies of Malacca, and the other primitive populations of Hindustan, of the red races of America, and the islanders of Polynesia. Such was that of the Aryans, Mongols, Chinese, Celts, Germans, and Slavonians." So this was a global belief system. But a woman who was quoted earlier gives us a clearer picture. Who are these spirits? Quote, "It is often admitted," says Lady Queenborough, "that the fallen angels or spirits will often manifest to people without even being called." Interesting. Necromancy, which is an attempt to communicate with the dead, condemned by God in Deuteronomy chapter 18 verses 9 to 12, especially in verse 11, is partly divining magic and partly operative magic. Now the practice consists in the evocation of the spirits of the dead, and devils can and do substitute themselves for the deceased. They will impersonate a dead person whose appearance is demanded by invocation. Now the narrator would like to stress that in Job chapter 7 verses 9 and 10, it is very clear that when you are dead, you are dead. And if you see anything that resembles a deceased relative, that is a devil masquerading itself as an angel of light. Now this woman, who looks like an innocent English Edwardian housewife, is British occultist Alice Ann Bailey, who founded Lucis Trust. She adopted the theosophical teachings of Madame Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, the 19th century Russian mystic, and incorporated it into her philosophy. And her own website does not conceal the fact that she was deeply fond and admired Lucifer, originally called the Light Bearer. But in her book titled The Externalization of the Hierarchy, she outlines from her spirit guides the occult agenda that will eventually unite the whole world, and she says, quote, "Hovering today within the aura of our planet are certain great spiritual forces and entities," basically fallen angels or demons, awaiting the opportunity to participate actively in the work of world redemption, readjustment, and reconstruction. Their presence is sensed at times by who? The spiritually minded people of the world, and their reality is recognized by mystics and occultists working where? In every land. For the what? And this is the phrase she popularized, the New Age and its coming civilization. It will be a predominantly capitalistic world run by several nations, but headed by who? China? Nope. The United States, towards the distant creation of the one world and one humanity. She said that everything must be given to the higher psychic powers. Everything, as many people are saying today, is spiritual. These energies are ever present and ever active. And a great and new movement is proceeding, and a tremendously increased interplay and interaction is taking place. And as someone shared this quote of hers with the narrator, the words highlighted in green says that this will go on until what year? AD 2025. This woman wrote this in the 1930s. Interesting. Now, the patriarch Abraham, by faith, left the city Ur of the Chaldees in what is now modern-day Iraq. Why? For he looked for a city which had foundations, whose builder and maker is God, according to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 10. But what was he leaving behind? Well, it has the oldest law, and this ancient city helped to build the modern world, confirming what Sir Austin Henry Layard said in the 19th century. And as Genesis chapter 10 said, it is the oldest built-up nation in human history. But the late Canadian-American esoteric writer Manly Palmer Hall said its impact is still with us to this very day, with the highest symbol in the occult still in use. That is from Babylon, the pentagram, that you can find in films and also in music videos, and is also the emblem of the United States Department of Defense. Now, the Babylonians worship the creature more than the creator, and its impact is still with us in films and music videos. And many may think that nature deities such as Pan, this half human, half goat deity, is from the Greeks. An image of it is in a museum in Cambridge, but not at all. A cylinder seal from the Near East, dated to around 2500 BC in the British Museum, shows the creature second from right, with the body of both a man and a goat, is Pan. And the bird on the bottom left was incorporated by the United States founding fathers and is the seal of the United States of America, a symbol that Manly Palmer Hall said represents the sun. Now, if there is another ancient civilization that also still impacts the world today, it is what the indigenous called Kemet, but today we call it Egypt. Even when outside invaders conquered it, they adopted its culture, something that has never been seen before in history. You can kind of understand why there is a fascination with this ancient nation, for they experimented with every known material that they put their hands upon, and today scholars debate over it. They continue to discover new finds, and many celebrities mimic the culture. For when the narrator has gone through many different museums, the Egyptian section is usually the rooms with the highest number of visitors, for it preserves its history like no other. In the United States, the Washington Monument is an Egyptian obelisk, and a founding father, Charles Thompson, was responsible for the seal of the United States. And when you look at one of the most marvelous monuments of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid, the founding fathers incorporated this monument as a symbol of the United States of America. The founding fathers' inspiration was not from the Bible, but from the ancient pagan world. Now, when the narrator was studying film studies, you're taught that there are 5 to 7 main narratives that all films are built around and stick to. And there's one narrative that has infiltrated, or the narrator could say has a subtle or even overt appearance in popular films. It is the belief that you can communicate with your deceased friends or relatives. An idea that was once seen as odd with most people who would secretly go to clairvoyance, but is now getting major attraction. And if you ever want to promote an idea, guess what you do? Use the biggest names. And what does that do? Well, it normalizes it. And the belief in the immortality of the soul has been prevalent in all ancient beliefs, and one of them is ancestor worship. When the narrator was a lot younger, he used to watch a cartoon called Thundercats, and anytime these feline heroes and heroines were in trouble, they would seek help from Jaga, their deceased ancestor. In George Lucas's The Return of the Jedi, the young Luke Skywalker would also receive advice from his deceased ancestor, Obi-Wan Kenobi. In the Harry Potter series in Hogwarts, they will also have the deceased ancestors on the walls talking to the pupils. And continuing that tradition, in the 2008 film Avatar, when the US Marine Jake Sully changed into a Na'vi, he was also communicating with the ancestors. 10 years later, in 2018, in the film Black Panther, T'Challa also met with his deceased father, also ancestor worship. And the director Ryan Coogler continued that ancestor worship tradition in the 2025 film Sinners, where after Smoke killed the Ku Klux Klan, he met his deceased wife and child, ancestor worship and the immortality of the soul. This vampire flick is only a continuation of a Hollywood tradition, and while many may have the idea that it was the Irish writer Bram Stoker who introduced vampires, Francois Lenormand tells us that the belief that the dead rose from the tomb under the form of vampires existed where? In Chaldea and Babylon. So though these ancient kingdoms ceased to exist, their ideas, especially the immortality of the soul, still remains with us to this very day. But this may be hard for many Americans to stomach, for they have been raised with a different indoctrinated narrative.
The first assertion that I want to make is that Americans have always believed that they were living in a Christian nation. Or at least, if I could nuance that a little bit more, Americans up until the 1970s and 80s, I would say, believed that in one form or another they were living in a Christian nation.
One of the most unsettling images I can recall was from the January 6, 2021 insurrection. A wooden cross propped up outside the U.S. Capitol, surrounded by a mob of people hoisting up American flags, not far from a faux hangman's platform and noose apparently intended for the vice president. You know, the verse that comes to mind is Romans 2:24, "For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you."
Now, the role of the watchman is to not only humbly correct unscriptural theological errors, but also historical fallacies. Now, we are shown that the entertainment industry has laid the groundwork for secular pagan ideas to become normalized, as Alice Bailey foretold. But does America qualify as a Christian nation or a dragon-speaking prophetic beast power? Well, let's see. In Luke chapter 3 and verse 14, when the soldiers asked John the Baptist a question, he told them, "Do violence to no man as a soldier." But in the midst of the US Civil War, the United States performed an horrific act and have tried to cover it up. It was known as the worst Indian massacre in US history, the January the 29th, 1863 Bear River Massacre, where men, women and children were mercilessly slaughtered by the US government. Evidence of it on a Google search is quite scarce. I wonder why. Then the following year, also in the midst of the US Civil War, the Camp Well Conference was held between Native Americans and settlers on September the 28th, 1864. The narrator believes it was a meeting of peace over land. But then 2 months later, on November 29th, 1864, the indigenous were slaughtered by the US government. It was called the Sand Creek Massacre. It has also been cleverly covered up. and you will have to do a thorough search online if you can find anything about it. Now, under President Andrew Jackson began the forced displacement of 5 civilized tribes and their slaves off their lands, titled the Trail of Tears, where Native American lands were now, up for sale. And in 1862, you had the Homestead Act, where settlers could now occupy Native American lands for free and got a head start in life. And there were many who came from Europe. Now, even though it was only for people of European descent, some black settlers had to fight hard to get a plot of land, and it was not easy. Because in that same year, the US government grudgingly enlisted black soldiers to fight for the Union in the North in the Civil War. And men like Frederick Douglass and his colleague in Haiti were encouraged to recruit blacks, but there was still a problem. Now, the Lord Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 28 verses 19 and 20 instructs his church to do what? Teach the nations. And in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 15, it says that this teaching or training must start from a very young child, so that when they are old, they will not depart from it. But the colonies did not want to follow that divine instruction. For in a book titled The English in the West Indies, when recording the condition of those plantations, the Oxford-educated English colonial apologist Anthony Froude said, quote, "There were 60,000 slaves and would rebel also if they had the hope of success." Now, why is that? Well, they were ill-fed and hard-driven. And look at the words highlighted in green. The Anglican clergy neither baptized them nor taught them anything, but regarded black people not as humans created by God, but as animals. For they reasoned to themselves that to keep Christians in slavery, they would be wrong and indefensible, and they therefore met the difficulty of not making their slaves into Christians. Interesting. Now, in a book titled The American Church is the Bulwark of American Slavery, James Gillespie Burney said, quote, "The slave states make it penal or against the law to teach the slaves to read, contrary to the instructions of Christ. So also some of them to teach the free colored people to read. Thus a free colored parent may suffer the penalty for teaching his own children to read even the scriptures." None of the slave-holding churches or religious bodies, so far as is known, have at any time remonstrated with the legislators against this iniquitous legislation or petitioned for its repeal or modification. Nor have they reproved or questioned such of their members as being also members of legislators sanctioned such legislation by their votes. Now, when you read these two slave narratives, not only were they denied the right to read, but it is hard to stomach the atrocities these professed Christians committed on their slaves. And even after slavery, the United States would publish imagery of black people to constantly remind them that they were animals and subhumans, an effect it has on people today.
What's your name?
Ice 44.
Okay, that's cool.
I hate your black skin. I hate your black pants. I hate black pepper. I hate black keys on the piano. I hate my gums because they black. I hate Whoopi Goldberg's lips.
And when you look at church and its ability to anchor movement, what are the reasons why? Church isn't speaking our language. There's a reason why young people want to go and sip bottomless mimosas than sit in a church and be told a language that no longer speaks to them, right? And so it is something for the church to say, okay, I am losing my folks. Let's make this adjustment because, again...
So slavery has left a deep-rooted fear of black people, as the New York Times said. But not just in America, but all over the world. as Frantz Fanon said also in the previous study on deception. And what does fear produce in people? Well, Machiavelli said it's fear and hatred that makes men attack each other. But why are people in the digital age in the 21st century still so uncomfortable with talking about slavery? The current Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America is cleverly trying to alter the past with his manifest destiny revisionist view of history, by painting the Founding Fathers as these squeaky clean, heroic figures, and cleverly ignoring how they financially sustained themselves. But the United States economic program and development was built on not only by stealing the indigenous people's land by force, but also by the inhumane unpaid labor of blacks. And though modern historians are trying ever so hard to ignore and downplay this episode of history, these English colonies cannot deny how they acquired their vast wealth. But in the British colonies of the West Indies, they also developed its vast wealth from slavery. For Anthony Froude said, quote, "The West Indian Islands once the pride of our empire, the scene of our most brilliant achievement. The slave trade was an imperial monopoly, extorted how? By force. Look into the West Indies only. For 2 centuries we furnished them with black servants whom we purchased on the African coast and carried over and sold there, making our own profits out of the trade. And the colonists prospered themselves and poured what? Wealth and strength into this empire, of which they were then an integral part. We had hitherto been what? Dependent on the West Indies." First witness. In another book titled Black People in the British Empire, the late English writer Peter Fryer also said, quote, "The British West Indies was a single crop economy. For 200 years, real English wealth, the sort of wealth that went with high rank and social prestige, would be measured in what? Guineas, which is to say, Africas. The coal and iron industries of South Wales depended directly on the triangular trade for their initial funding. The North Wales slate industry, producing roofing slates for factory workers' dwellings, was financed by profits from the triangular trade. The South Yorkshire iron industry, the Liverpool and the Manchester Railway, and the original steam engine of James Watt were all financed in part with profits accumulated from the triangular trade. The early history of the British banking system, from the first country banks and Barclays right up to the Bank of England, is closely connected with the triangular trade, as is the early history of British insurance. So Britain, like the United States, accumulated its wealth from slavery, but revisionists are trying to rewrite the past.
In fact, there's a very strong argument to be said that the cost of maintaining the empire negated any profits that could have possibly been made from slavery. And you have to essentially understand that the reason Britain was able to embark upon the slave trade and to embark upon colonization was because it was already a rich country. So it's actually the other way around. It was because Britain was developing so rapidly that it was able to embark upon that sort of process.
So you can clearly see that there are men who are trying to cleverly distort important episodes of human history. But if you really want to know how North America was developed, how it works, and how it perfectly fits into the divine prophetic timetable, you have to look to its roots in England. Now, the narrator was taught to believe that the United States of America was founded by a persecuted minority group from England called the Pilgrim Fathers. Then in the distant future, it undoes its constitution, then it turns into a tyranny. But as we've seen in this study, it has always been a tyranny. And men like Adam Smith, John Locke, John Milton, Captain John Smith, and Dr. Samuel Johnson left us the true history of its founding. And in Samuel Johnson's Taxation and Tyranny, he says, quote, "An English colony is a number of persons to whom the king grants a charter permitting them to settle in some distant country and enabling them to constitute a what? Corporation, enjoying such powers as the charter grants to be administered in such form as the Charter prescribes. So how did this charter work in these corporations? Well, in a description of New England, the man who helped found one of the early English colonies, John Smith, said, quote, "New England, the first colony, is that part of America in the ocean sea opposite to Nova Albion in the South Sea. It was discovered by the most memorable Sir Francis Drake in his voyage about the world." But was this expansion for the gospel? Well, in A Short History of New England, Volume 1, the Baptist Nonconformist minister and historian Isaac Backus said, quote, that several attempts were made to plant New England, not to evangelize, but solely for what? Worldly motives. But it all proved abortive. Now, evidence is now coming out in the 21st century that New England's economy was built on the backs of black slaves. And though there are sincere Christians in that nation, it doesn't mean that everybody benefited. For Morgan Godwin said that the Quakers, who with the New England men had no problem with profiting from black slaves, but whose meetings the Negroes are therefore strictly prohibited or banned. Is that Christianity? Now, in another book titled The History of the Puritans, Volume 1, English historian and minister Daniel Neal confirms what Samuel Johnson said, quote, that among the Brownists in Holland, before they set sail on the Mayflower, the younger part of the congregation resolved to remove into some part of where? America, under the protection of the King of England, for the new what? Plantation, where they sailed for New England on August the 5th, 1620. Now, the English Protestants, with their clever revisionist 19th century artwork and paintings, said that these people were fleeing persecution. But that is a complete lie. How can you be fleeing persecution and be protected from the one who you are being persecuted from? The history is not quite adding up. For in a book titled Good News from New England, one of the individuals who was on the 1620 Mayflower ship said something very interesting. And Edward Winslow said, quote, "Right honourable worshipful gentlemen, or whatsoever, since it hath pleased God to stir you up to instruments of his glory in so honourable enterprise as the enlarging of what? His Majesty's dominions, by planting his loyal subjects in so healthful and hopeful a country as New England is." So the only known painting of a Pilgrim Father, Edward Winslow, said that the reason that they went to New England in the first place was not because they were being persecuted, but as a settler colony corporation. They were expanding the dominion of the British or English Empire. So let us see how this beast power, not a Christian nation, developed in the following century. Now, if you carefully analyze US history as it develops, contrary to the squeaky clean image that we are used to, it is very, very violent and bloody indeed. And when the founding fathers, men who are lionized as libertarian freedom fighters, were trying to separate the 13 colonies from the King of England so they wouldn't have to pay taxes, unbeknownst to many, most of these men were secular-minded humanists, deists, Rosicrucians, and Freemasons. Now, the first US President, George Washington, on the left, and Benjamin Franklin on the right are adorned in their Masonic attire, a secret society that traces its roots to both Egypt and Babylon. And though religion played a part in that nation, Article 6, Clause 3 of the Constitution of the United States of America of 1787 made it unequivocally clear that the words highlighted in yellow is that religion should not be a test for any role in office. And the 1791 First Amendment of the Bill of Rights makes it clear that religious belief should not be legislated, that it is a personal and private affair. But the Founding Fathers' inspiration not only came from Africa and Asia, but also in Europe, where they formed that new nation from the ideas of the Greco-Roman world. The Greek influence on the shaping of the modern Western world is a little underestimated. But in a book titled The Federalist Papers, a discussion among the Founding Fathers of how America was formed and shaped, one of its contributors, James Madison, said, quote, "Among the confederacies of antiquity, the most considerable was that of the Grecian republics, associated under the Amphitonic Council. From the best accounts transmitted of this celebrated institution, it bore a very instructive analogy to what? The present confederation of the American states." So the Founding Fathers confirmed that the foundation of the United States was built on the Greco-Roman world. This clearly qualifies it as a beast power. A beast is symbolically a kingdom in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 23. And if you carefully look at London's National Portrait Gallery in Trafalgar Square, on the lawn is a statue of President George Washington, a gift from the United States to the UK, and it shows him with the bundle of rods called the fasces. And in the British Museum, you'll see an Italian from ancient Rome with the fasces, the bundle of rod with the axe, an insignia that Benito Mussolini adopted. But while today people think that fascism has fully developed with Donald Trump, scholars who are studying America's true history are seeing that America has always been fascist, nothing new under the sun about her policy. And this fascism has existed in America since its embryonic beginnings in the 1700s. Now, if America was a place of freedom, as we are taught, then why did more blacks fight on the side of the British Crown during the American Revolutionary War? Do you want to know why? They were literally fighting for their lives, for the British offered them freedom while the Founding Fathers wanted to keep them enslaved. For as the slaveholder James Madison said, quote, "Slaves are considered as property, not as persons. They ought therefore to be comprehended in estimates of taxation, which are founded on property, and to be excluded from representation, which is regulated by a census of persons. It is the character bestowed on them by the laws under which they live, because it is only under the pretext that the laws have transformed the Negroes into subjects of property that is a place is disputed them in the computation of numbers, and it is admitted that if the laws were to restore the right which have been taken away, the Negroes could no longer be refused an equal share of representation with the other inhabitants." Now, the narrator has observed that many of black African descent are returning to their native beliefs, having very little idea that these same beliefs can be traced to the same pagan tribes all over the world. They say Christianity is a white man's religion that enslaved their forefathers. But the Bible promotes no such thing at all. For in Exodus chapter 21 and verse 16, God said, "Anyone who steals another person and sells him shall be put to death." Deuteronomy chapter 23 verses 15 and 16 says that if a servant escapes from his master and he comes into your care, you are not meant to oppress him. This is God speaking. And in the New Testament in Colossians 4 and verse 1, God said that the masters are to treat their servants equal and just as they have a master in heaven. And in James chapter 5 verses 1 and 4, God condemns those rich men who did not pay their laborers. This is where the reparations argument comes from. So where did the inspiration of slavery come from? On the plantations. Now, in a book titled Politics by the 4th century BC Greek philosopher Aristotle, he said, quote, "And so in the arrangement of the family, a slave is a living possession and a property number of such instruments." So you see where James Madison got his ideas from. The slave is not only the slave of his master, but wholly belongs to him. Hence we see what is the nature and office of a slave. He who is by nature, he says, not his own, but another's, and yet a man, is by nature a slave, and he may be said to belong to another who, being a human being, is also a possession. There is no difficulty in answering this question on grounds both of reason and of fact, for that some should rule others and others be ruled is a thing not only necessary but expedient. He says that from the hour of their birth, some are marked out for subjection, others for rule. This mindset still sadly dominates the psychology of many in the West, and James Madison and Chief Justice Taney a lot later, in response to Dred Scott, said that blacks are not equal according to the Constitution of the United States. They were following the ideas of Aristotle and not the Bible. And as people are realizing that many of these slave laws have not really been repealed, revisionists, to avoid the horrors of the past and its effect on the present, are now cleverly altering history.
I'm grateful to the Supreme Court for stepping in and solving this very, very big and complex problem, and they've made it very simple. I want to thank Justice Barrett, who wrote the opinion brilliantly, as well as Chief Justice Roberts, and Justices Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Thomas. Great people. Thanks for this decision, and thanks to this decision, we can now promptly file to proceed with numerous policies that have been wrongly enjoined on a nationwide basis. And some of the cases we're talking about would be ending birthright citizenship, which now comes to the fore. That was meant for the babies of slaves. It wasn't meant for people trying to scam the system and come into the country on a vacation. This was, in fact, it was the same date, the exact same date, the end of the Civil War. It was meant for the babies of slaves, and it's so clean and so obvious.
And you got to the slave trade, and you had to confront the fact that you were not kidnapped. Like, people who you would look at as black sold you. So it wasn't that these people came and got you. And this was like heartbreaking. This was like devastating. You know what I mean? Like, it took like weeks for me to like accept that in my mind, because the neat narrative of having been stolen, right, is so much easier. Right. You know, you can easily assign villains, heroes, etc. But no, you soldiers, and then it's like,
also importantly, people need to understand and remember that no Europeans enslaved Africans. European ships were moored off the coast of West Africa, and there were slave markets built along the shore, and other Africans were enslaving their fellow Africans. And there were actually more Africans held in bondage in Africa than were ever transported across the Atlantic.
Not a single society or civilization in human history, in all of human history, that hasn't practiced slavery. It seems like it's an innate instinct that human beings have. If they have the capacity to enslave others, they will. Africans were enslaving each other. Chinese were enslaving each other. It's everywhere. It was in Greece, it was in Rome. It has been the norm throughout history across the globe. The only civilization that tried to end slavery was the West. We are the only civilization that has provided the language, the concepts to end it. The abolitionist movement began in Britain with echoes in North America. It was Britain that ended the transatlantic slave trade. They dedicated in the 19th century, in the 1800s, 13% of their naval resources were dedicated to simply blockading the coast of West Africa to try and end the slave trade, because the Africans were so gung-ho on keeping up the transatlantic slave trade. You had Dahomey members, the pre-Nigeria, actively going out and getting their fellow Africans to bring them to the slave markets. This was completely a mutual transactional transaction. Britain occupied Lagos in 1861 to try and decouple it from the slave trade.
So it is black people, they say, who are solely responsible for the Atlantic slave trade, and it is white Europeans who are the true liberators. And these Anglo-American analysts are all parroting the revisionist script of the US economist Thomas Sowell, the Harvard-educated Milton Friedman protege, who has a Chicago School of Neoclassical Economic worldview, and he is a staunch Western imperial apologist. His deeply biased quantitative approach to history is limited and lacks any real empirical depth. And as we bring this study to a close, let us unpack and clear up these individuals' Disneyfied view of history. As shown throughout this study, the best way to approach human history is through God's lens in the Holy Scriptures. For if it is honestly read by faith and conviction, then the most racially divided institution on the earth, the Western Church, can help it to improve race relations, which will also impact the world. And we shall start history with the roots of man's early origins in the book of Genesis, first from an analytical approach. In the Colored American magazine, this journal written by a prolific writer and historian, Pauline Hopkins, this intellectual activist said, quote, "The ancient Ethiopian capital Meroe was the royal line of Queen Candace. The very soil of Egypt was pilfered from the Nile from the foundations of Meroe. It is a fact that Egypt drew from Ethiopia all the arts, sciences and knowledge of which she was the mistress. Babylon and Egypt, Nimrod, who the New World Order and the Mark of the Beast structure is modeled after, and Mithraim, both descendants of Ham, led the way and acted as pioneers of mankind in the untrodden fields of knowledge." We have already seen in this study that the foundation of modern cities can be traced to Genesis chapter 10, where the first civilization was developed. And a few scholars are confirming that it was formed by Nimrod. Egypt, as also shown already, still has an influence in the modern world. They had the oldest highway, the oldest dress, the oldest prosthetic foot, and the oldest geological map. Scholars are not only confirming how powerful the Sudan was in ancient Nubia, but Egypt's roots can be traced to Nubia, which is modern-day Sudan. And scholars, though reluctantly, are admitting this. For as shown in a previous study, archaeologists are confirming that for thousands of years, there may have been conflicts, but both Nubia, or the Sudan, and Egypt were very well integrated. Or you could almost say one complete system. When you look at these images of both the Egyptians and the Nubians in museums in the UK, don't they look strikingly the same? Their features and their texture and their clothing. Interesting, isn't it? Now, in the British Museum, there is a statue of a Nubian female who is of noble royalty. And this female's lineage continued to the Candace dynasty in the apostolic days. One of the queens is also in the British Museum. Although not mentioned by name, the writer of the book of Acts recorded her. This is the second nobility from the Sudan mentioned in the Bible. But did these blacks enslave each other? Well, let's go to the second witness. In a book titled Grounding with My Brothers, the late Guyanese activist Walter Rodney, continuing the same narrative, said, quote, "On the River Nile there was Egypt and Meroe, the Sudan. These kingdoms flourished on earth before the birth of Christ. In ancient Ethiopia there was the kingdom of Aksum, forerunner to the Ethiopian kingdom, famous for its architecture, especially its tall and finely carved stone pillars, and its churches carved out of solid rock. Apart from the states of Egypt, Meroe, Aksum, Ghana, Mali, Songhay, and Karem, there are many others in different parts of Africa. The states of Benin and Oyo were famous in Central Africa. We can take examples Congo and Monomotapa, which is in Zimbabwe. Please forgive the pronunciation. And in East Africa, two of the oldest kingdoms were those of Bunyoro and Buganda. However, the majority of Africans lived in small societies. From the earliest cave art in the Sahara to the dynasty of Nubian kings in the Sudan, to the highly sophisticated naturalist Ife art of the Yoruba people of Nigeria. Prior to the ongoing Euro-Arab imperialism, Africa has always been quote-unquote civilized. The barbarism of constant warfare only took place afterwards in recent times. Now this contradicts the Arnold Toynbee imperialist perception of an uncivilized Africa, for it had one of the most vast book collections in the world in the once well-renowned and infamous library of Timbuktu in the West African country of Mali, where recently African curators have been preserving its history in the midst of modern wars. And included in the 14th century European medieval map called the Catalan Atlas is an image of Mali's most famous ruler, Mansa Musa. He was relatively little known until recently when scholars calculated his wealth, and they found that this African king was the most richest person in recorded human history. Now, when Western explorers have visited Africa, they found a different type of architectural style. For in Ethiopia, they found buildings not built from the ground up, but the other way around. What Walt Rodney described as an architectural wonder. And though European colonialists attempted but failed to destroy it, the southern landlocked country called Zimbabwe, with its famous waterfall called Mosai Tonya, that David Livingstone renamed Victoria Falls, there is in Great Zimbabwe an African Iron Age city with highly sophisticated architecture with mortar stone construction, with the largest single ancient structure in that geography. But what is even more fascinating is African art, where in museums around the world there is highly sophisticated metallurgy from Nigeria, the most famous being the Benin art. And when you look at this beautifully designed episode of history, guess what? These African artists from the 14th to the 17th century also incorporated Europeans, who were the Portuguese, in their history. But the narrator would like to ask a very serious and personal question. Do you see anybody enslaving each other? Because that is the undocumented revisionist narrative that we are presented with. But please look at the artwork very carefully, and please show me where you see people either enslaving each other or selling their own people. Do you see it? If not, then you have been lied to about history. This 1630s map of Africa is by the Dutch cartographer in the center. Do you see any image of slavery? There is none. The 18th century French botanist and naturalist Michel Adanson, when searching for plants in Africa, he saw people having fun, but no slavery. John Wesley, in his thoughts on slavery when describing the different tribes in West Africa, he said they were friendly, but they were not enslaving each other. Another English abolitionist, Thomas Clarkson, in his book Letters on the Slave Trade, said that in Africa, if there were slaves, they would be able to marry, choose their own wives, and there is no distinction between the master and the slave. In My Bondage and My Freedom, Frederick Douglass said, quote, "There were slaves here direct from Guinea, and there were many who could say that their fathers and mothers were what? Stolen from Africa, forced from their homes, and compelled to serve as slaves." In the book Slave Life in Georgia, published in the same year, the former slave John Brown, also known as Fed, said, quote, "My name is John Brown. I was called Fed. I believe my father and his family were bred on Benford's plantation. His father had been, what? Stolen from Africa. He was of the Igbo tribe of Nigeria." So these two witnesses' accounts contradicts the revisionist view of history with a man who's pleading the case for reparations. Now, in the 18th century, some blacks did get greedy and profited from their own people. And it is this small episode which is the reason why many black people hate God, hate the white race, and they also hate themselves. This is what happens when history is manipulated. And the brutal Dahomey female warriors that many blacks sadly revere captured and sold their own, as one slave documented in America in his autobiography. Now, the narrator has to give due credit to the Quaker Thomas Garrett in the background, Baptist John Brown on the left, and former Southern Unionist soldier Newton Knight on the right. These three men of European descent fought for the abolition of slavery, one of them even losing his own life. Now, Denmark Vesey, the West Indian-born, US-based African Methodist Episcopal preacher of Black African descent in the background, and Samuel Sharp, the Jamaican Baptist preacher, also of Black African descent on the right, were both executed for masterminding plots to free their people in bondage, for the conditions were inhumane. But studies have shown that blacks were constantly revolting for their freedoms once they arrived in those plantations. Well, it was in Ecuador, the black abolition lawyer Luis Garmel in Brazil, the Maroon community in St. Vincent, the Maroon community in Suriname in South America, the 1823 Demira uprising in Guyana that led to emancipation, Barbados, St. Lucia, St. Croix, or even on the slave ships in Cuba, where Joseph Sink led a revolt for his and other slaves' freedom. But as the narrator has kept you for 3 hours, he will summarize this study on deception. It is very important that you have the correct view of human history, and that can only be according to the Bible, for it can affect how you perceive God, how you look at the world, and how you relate to each other. And while it is very important to be aware of where we are in prophetic time, there is one key point that will keep you stable in life. And William Whitaker advises that the only true comfort in life consists in living with communion with God. And as the watchman signs off, whatever decisions you are making today will decide where you want to be in the future. And I hope and pray that eternity will be your choice.
I really hope that you enjoyed the study. I know it was a lot to take in. I have no regrets for keeping you for 3 hours. It's important that you have a clear understanding of what is really taking place in this world, so you can understand the decisions you're going to make each day. This is the second study of how to avoid or look at deception. In part 3, we're going to look at something which is very, very influential on a lot of Christians and non-Christians today. It is the belief in something called the Nephilim. Did angels sleep with fallen man after the fall? That's going to be in the next study on how to avoid deception.
Gabriel, there is chaos in the mortal realm. A new breed of evil has emerged, born of shadow and flesh.
Nephilim.
They are the unclean, and if they are not stopped, they could unravel the very fabric of creation itself.
The main thing they want you to believe is the supernatural is not real.
Tucker Carlson and many talking news heads talking about the Nephilim.
And it's described in Genesis. Spirit reproduces with human woman.
There's all kinds of conversation about what's flying over DC, aliens, UFOs. If you're a spirit-filled Christian, you probably believe that we are in the end times.